Dr. Horeck here. I want to look back at last year's harvest, Dr. Horeck. Does N-loss, as you look back, compare with what you've studied about combining nitrogen applications and center pivot irrigation?
Well, there's some interesting things about N-loss. It's not until very recently we've been able to say, hey, you lost 10 pounds per acre, or 20 pounds per acre, or 30 pounds per acre. As John was talking about, we were able to tell relative differences between products and practices and things of that nature, but it's only until the last 2-3 years that we've been able to have the technology to say, hey, you're losing X amount of pounds per acre, and what are the management practices you can use to influence that loss? And one of the things is irrigation. The other things is AGROTAIN and products like that. And if you going to show our slide up there?
There we go.
We got a circle that shows, this is irrigation circle where we had a trial on that has 16 different irrigation rates on it, looking at AGROTAIN and other different products and how they're functioning both with irrigation and timing of that irrigation and quantity of that irrigation and influence ammonia loss. And so different products have different risks for ammonia loss. And one of the product that has the highest risk for ammonia loss is urea. And so if you look at the slide here, we got 25% of our nitrogen lost as urea. We applied 150 pounds of N per acre. So that ends up being about 38 pounds of N that is lost to the air. This is a spring, this is a fall application on grass seed. The circle you were looking at previously was a spring application on wheat. On that circle, with 0 water applied, without AGROTAIN, we lost between 60 and 70% of our nitrogen applied. With AGROTAIN, we're losing less than 5% of the nitrogen applied. So if you look at the grass seed data here behind me, you can see that where we use urea, we're losing 25% of our N. Where we're using solution 32, we come down to about half of that. Where we use a product called CAN 27, which is a calcium ammonium nitrate product, we're losing a little bit less. And if you look at the AGROTAIN, we're down there at the bottom, losing virtually 0 of the nitrogen applied.
When you gathered those results, did they surprise you? Were the numbers more dramatic than you would have thought?
The 25% N loss doesn't shock me at all. That's 25% of that 150, which is about 38 pounds of N. But the 60 to 70% N loss that we saw at the wheat shocked us. I mean, we were shocked. I thought we had mucked up the experiment, but every time we went back, looked at data, I mean, these are all replicated trials that, you know, we can statistically tell the differences between products and losses and things of that nature. But we went back and measured nitrogen in the plant. We went back measuring nitrogen in the soil, and everything told us that, yes, the losses were real.
I guess what surprises me, and getting back to what Dr. Below talked about, you can't control the weather, but with an irrigation system, you kind of feel like you're at least controlling rainfall, if nothing else, but you still have these dramatic numbers.
Controlling rainfall helps you a lot in the irrigation system, so we can substitute rainfall a little bit for AGROTAIN. In other words, if you got your nitrogen on the surface and it's there, you can apply water and use it to incorporate. But you can look at how fast we're losing our nitrogen. We're losing our nitrogen in a week. It's disappearing pretty quick. And it takes at least about a ½ inch of rain or irrigation to incorporate that urea to minimize volatilization. It still doesn't do quite the job that AGROTAIN does, but it gets you down in that 4 to 5, 6% loss rate.
I'm going to get back to that in a moment. I want to go back to John. You know, what we're hearing is AGROTAIN makes a great difference in preventing nitrogen loss or slowing down nitrogen loss so you don't lose nearly as much. And these are significant numbers. Obviously, they impact a farmer's bottom line. Let's just kind of step back a little bit and explain how is nitrogen lost? How do we lose nitrogen? There are several ways, right?
All right, there are several modes of loss. And I briefly discussed a little bit about volatility, where you put your urea on the surface, gets moisture, starts to break down, the urease enzyme comes into play, and then we can see up to 30%. And the reason I'm using 30% and not Don's 60% is because I want to be conservative on this. All right, and then we, in most of our studies, show around 30-35% loss. So if we use AGROTAIN, then we minimize that loss. We allow that nitrogen to get into the ground to be optimized by that crop and maximized by that crop for the greatest grain yield that it can get on the amount of nitrogen that's available. Now, there are other modes of action too. One is called denitrification, where we actually have the nitrogen species turning into a form of gas, and we're losing that also as it bubbles up through the soil. The third one is leaching. Nitrogen species moves away from the root zone, not available to the plant, and all of a sudden we've got loss. So when you start looking at these three mechanisms, we're not just losing 30%, we're losing upwards of maybe 50, 60, 70%.